The frost came early to the Bitterroot Range that year. By mid-October, Claire Madsen could see her breath when she stepped on the porch each morning. The wood planks slick with ice that melted by noon, but returned each night like a promise or a threat. She'd been living in the cabin for 11 months now. Almost a full year of solitude, of learning to measure time by the migration of elk herds and the changing angle of sunlight to the pine trees, rather than by calendar dates or appointments or the rhythms of a life she no longer lived. The cabin sat at 8,200 feet, tucked into a natural shelf with a mountain face folded back on itself. Her grandfather had built it in 1952, back when men still carved homes out of wilderness with hand tools and determination. 2 rooms, a loft, and a stone fireplace that drew perfectly if you knew how to build a fire right. Claire had learned. She'd learned a lot of things in 11 months. The well was 30 yards from the back door, hand-dug and spring-fed, water so cold it made your teeth ache. The outhouse was another 20 yards past that, positioned downwind and downslope like her grandfather had known what he was doing. Solar panels her father had installed in the 1990s provided enough electricity for lights, and a small refrigerator, though Claire had learned to live mostly without. Candles and kerosene lamps felt more honest somehow, more appropriate to what she was doing up here. What she was doing was surviving. That's what she told herself in the hard days when the isolation felt less like peace and more like punishment. She was surviving Paul's death, surviving the cancer that had taken him in 6 brutal months, surviving the well-meaning friends who wanted her to join grief groups and start dating again and get back out there, as if there was someone to get back to, as if the world held anything she wanted anymore. So she'd come here, to her grandfather's cabin, to the place she'd spent childhood summers learning to fish and track and read the forest moods. Her father had kept it maintained until his own death 3 years ago, and then it had sat empty, waiting. When Paul died, Claire had known exactly where she needed to go. Her German shepherd Gunner had been Paul's dog originally. 3 years old when Paul got sick, loyal in that particular way of dogs who understand when their person is suffering. After Paul died, Gunner had transferred that loyalty to Claire, following her from room to room in their Denver house, pressing against her legs when the grief threatened to pull her under. When she'd packed a truck and driven north into Montana, Gunner had sat in the passenger seat like he'd been waiting for this journey his whole life. In the 11 months since, he'd become more than a companion. He'd become her early warning system, her reason to get up on mornings when staying in bed felt easier, her connection to something living and present when the past tried to drag her backward. Now he stood at the edge of the clearing, nose lifted to the wind, ears forward. 100 pounds of muscle and intelligence, black and tan coat, thick, for the coming winter. He'd been acting strange for the past week, distracted, focused on something Claire couldn't identify. "What is it, boy?" she called. Gunner glanced back at her, then returned his attention to whatever had caught his interest. It wasn't game. She knew his hunting stance, the particular intensity he brought to tracking deer or elk. This was different. This was persistent and puzzled, like he'd found something that didn't make sense but couldn't be ignored. Claire walked over to where he stood, near the front corner of the cabin. The foundation here was river rock and mortar, her grandfather's careful work, solid despite 6 decades of weather. Gunner sniffed along the base, whined low in his throat, and then began to dig. "Hey, stop that." Claire grabbed his collar. "You'll damage the foundation." But Gunner pulled against her grip, something he never did, and dug harder. His claws scraped against rock and dirt, frantic now, determined. "Gunner, no." He stopped at her command, but looked at her with those dark eyes, pleading. Then he whined again and pawed at the ground, more gently this time, but no less insistent. Claire knelt beside him and ran her hand over the foundation stones. Everything looked solid, normal. She pressed against the mortar, checking for cracks or weakness. Nothing unusual. Whatever Gunner was sensing, she couldn't detect it. "There's nothing there," she told him. "Come on, let's get breakfast." But for the rest of that day and the next and the one after that, Gunner kept returning to that corner of the cabin. He'd dig a little, stop when Claire corrected him, but never give up entirely. It became a pattern, an obsession. Something was down there, and he was determined to reach it. On the 4th day, Claire brought a shovel. She told herself she was just checking the foundation, making sure there wasn't a rodent infestation or structural damage Gunnar could somehow smell. But as she dug, clearing away the decades of accumulated soil and pine needles, she felt something shift inside her. The first stirring of curiosity she'd experienced in almost a year. The first break in the careful numbness she'd wrapped around herself like armor. The soil came away easily at first, then hit resistance. She worked the shovel carefully, not wanting to damage anything. Gunnar sat beside her, watching intently, tail wagging slowly. And then the blade of the shovel hit something that definitely wasn't rock. Metal. Claire set down the shovel and used her hands, brushing away dirt like she was on an archaeological dig. The metal was rusted but intact, running horizontally beneath the foundation. Not a pipe, the shape was wrong. More like a hinge. She dug wider, following the line of metal. It extended maybe 3 feet, then turned at a right angle. Another hinge, then another span of metal. A door, or a hatch. Her heart was suddenly pounding, adrenaline cutting through the careful calm she maintained for months. There was something under the cabin, something deliberately hidden, built into the foundation, or maybe built before the foundation, something her grandfather had either known about or never discovered. Claire sat back on her heels, hands dirty, breathing hard. Gunnar pressed against her side, and she wrapped an arm around him. "Good boy," she whispered. "You found something, didn't you?" The question was what? And the deeper question, the one that made her chest tight, was something that might be fear or might be hope. Did she really want to know? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. Claire spent the rest of that day excavating. She worked carefully, methodically, the way her grandfather had taught her to approach any project in the mountains. Slow and steady wins the race. Haste makes waste. Measure twice. Cut once. His voice in her head, patient and certain, even though he'd been dead for 20 years. The hatch revealed itself piece by piece. It was larger than she'd initially thought, maybe 4 feet square, set into a concrete frame that had been poured before or around the cabins. Foundation. The metal was steel, heavy gauge, designed to last. The hinges were massive, industrial grade, though rust had claimed their shine. There was a handle, recessed into the metal, and when Claire brushed away the last of the dirt, she found a lock. Not a padlock, but something built into the hatch itself, requiring a key she didn't have. She stood and studied what she'd uncovered, while Gunnar circled the hatch, sniffing and occasionally pawing at the edges. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks, throwing long shadows across the clearing. The temperature was already falling, the frost gathering its strength for another night. Claire had a choice to make. She could cover the hatch back up, pretend she'd never found it, return to the careful isolation she'd built for herself. Or she could open it and face whatever lay beneath. In her old life, in Denver, she'd been a high school history teacher. 23 years of helping teenagers understand how the past shaped the present, how understanding where we came from helped us know who we were. She'd loved that work, loved the moment when a student's eyes lit up with connection, when history stopped being dates and names and became human stories. Paul had been a civil engineer, practical and precise, someone who solved problems through mathematics and physics. Together they'd been balanced. Her interest in the why of human behavior, his focus on the how of physical structures. They'd talked about everything, argued cheerfully about politics and philosophy, and whether history really did repeat itself, or that was just something people said to feel less helpless. Then Paul got sick, and all the talking in the world couldn't change what was happening. All her understanding of history couldn't stop the inevitable. All his engineering couldn't build a structure strong enough to hold back death. After he died, Claire had stopped wanting to understand anything. She'd stopped wanting connection, or meaning, or even hope. She wanted silence and solitude and the freedom to grieve without anyone watching or judging or telling her she was doing it wrong. But standing here now, looking at this mysterious hatch her dog had found, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in almost a year. She felt curious. She felt engaged. She felt, for just a moment, like maybe there was still something in the world worth paying attention to. She went inside and rummaged through the toolbox her grandfather had left behind. found a crowbar, a hammer, a set of wrenches, brought them outside, and knelt beside the hatch. The lock was old but solid. She tried forcing it with the crowbar, but the metal barely flexed. Whatever was down there, someone had wanted it secure. Gunnar whined and pawed at the hatch again. "I know, boy. I'm working on it." She examined the hinges instead. Rust had made them brittle, weakened them. If she couldn't get through the lock, maybe she could take apart the hinges. It took an hour of patient work with a hammer and a cold chisel, but finally the first hinge pin came free. The second followed more easily. The third was stubborn, but eventually yielded. With all three hinges disabled, Claire was able to lever up the edge of the hatch using the crowbar. It was heavy. She had to use her full weight, but inch by inch it rose. When she had it high enough, she shoved a log underneath to prop it open. Darkness below, a smell of old air, stale but not foul, and stone steps descending into shadow. Claire pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut into the darkness, revealing stairs that went down at least 10 feet before turning out of sight. The walls on either side were concrete, rough finished but solid. Professional work, not some amateur's attempt at a root cellar. "Stay," she told Gunnar, though he was already pressing forward, eager to explore. She needed better light, better preparation. This wasn't something to rush into in the gathering dark. Tomorrow morning, with full daylight and proper equipment, she'd explore whatever lay beneath her grandfather's cabin. But as she lowered the hatch back into place and secured it with a heavy rock, as she gathered her tools and called Gunnar to follow her inside, Claire knew sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. Someone had built something under this cabin. Something substantial, something hidden, something that had waited in darkness for decades. Her grandfather's cabin had sat on this land since 1952. That meant this space, whatever it was, had been here for at least 70 years. The question that kept circling through her mind as she built a fire and made dinner was simple but profound. Had her grandfather known about it? And if he had, why had he never mentioned it? Why had her father, who'd maintained this place for decades, never discovered it? Or had he? Was this something her family had known about and deliberately kept secret? Claire ate without tasting, her mind racing through possibilities. A root cellar, maybe, though the construction seemed too elaborate. A shelter of some kind, though from what? A storage space, though for what purpose? Or something else entirely. Something her grandfather had built or found or inherited. Something significant enough to hide beneath a cabin in one of the most remote parts of Montana. Gunnar ate his dinner and then came to sit beside her chair, resting his massive head on her knee. She scratched his ears absently, staring into the fire. Paul would have loved this mystery. He would have wanted to map the space, measure it, understand its engineering. They would have explored it together, she identifying historical context, he assessing structural integrity. They would have made it an adventure. But Paul was gone, and Claire was alone except for a German shepherd who'd found something impossible to ignore. She thought about the past 11 months, about choosing isolation, about believing that grief was something you survived by removing yourself from everything that could hurt you. But sitting here now, with her mind engaged for the first time in nearly a year, Claire wondered if maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe you didn't survive grief by hiding from it. Maybe you survived by finding something new to care about, some new question to answer, some new mystery to solve. Tomorrow she'd go down those stairs. Tomorrow she'd face whatever waited in the darkness beneath her grandfather's cabin. Tonight, she'd let herself feel something other than numbness. She'd let herself feel anticipation, curiosity, even excitement. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was movement. And movement, Claire was beginning to remember, was how you stay alive. Section 2, the catalyst. Morning came cold and clear. The sky, that particular shade of blue that only existed at high altitude. Claire woke before dawn, her body responding to a pattern she'd established over 11 months. Rise with the first light, build a fire, make coffee, begin the day before her mind could remember all the reasons staying in bed might be easier. But today was different. Today she had purpose beyond simple routine. She dressed in layers, thermal underwear, flannel shirt, wool sweater, canvas work pants. pulled on her insulated boots and her grandfather's old jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of pipe tobacco even after all these years. She braided her hair, a practical choice to keep it out of her way, and studied her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. 46 years old, though some days she felt 70. The mountain had weathered her face, added lines around her eyes and mouth. She'd lost weight over the past year. Grief had stolen her appetite more effectively than any diet. Her hair, once a warm brown, was shot through with gray she'd stopped bothering to color. She looked like a woman who'd been living alone on a mountain for almost a year. She looked like someone who'd chosen isolation over connection, silence over conversation, survival over living. But this morning, looking back at herself, Claire saw something else too. She saw determination. She saw curiosity. She saw the flicker of who she used to be before grief had hollowed her out. Gunnar was already waiting by the door, tail wagging, knowing somehow that the day was different. Dogs always knew. Claire made coffee and forced herself to eat oatmeal with dried berries, though her stomach was tight with anticipation. She packed a backpack with supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, water, protein bars, first aid kit, rope, her phone, even though there was no signal up here. She added her grandfather's old camping lantern, the battery-powered kind that could light up a whole room. By the time full daylight arrived, she was ready. Outside, the frost sparkled like diamond dust on every surface. The clearing around the cabin looked pristine and untouched, as if no one had been digging here yesterday, as if nothing unusual lay hidden beneath ordinary ground. Claire removed the rock she'd used to secure the hatch and, with effort, levered it open again. The darkness below seemed deeper in daylight somehow, more absolute. The smell of stale air wafted up, carried with it something else, not decay, but age. The particular scent of a space that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. She turned on the camping lantern and lowered it into the opening on a rope, watching as its bright LED light pushed back the shadows. The stairs descended 12 feet. She could count them now. To a landing. From there, a corridor seemed to extend deeper into the earth, though she couldn't see how far. "All right," she said to Gunnar, more to steady herself than because he needed instruction. "Let's see what you found." She descended carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The stairs were concrete, the same rough finish as the walls, and they felt solid despite their age. At the bottom, she stepped onto the landing and lifted the lantern high. The corridor stretched ahead for maybe 20 feet, before opening into what looked like a larger space. The walls were the same poured concrete, and the ceiling, she reached up to touch it, was supported by metal I-beams. Professional construction. Serious engineering. This wasn't some amateur project, dug out by hand. Gunnar descended behind her, his claws clicking on concrete, and pressed close to her leg. Even he seemed uncertain about this strange underground place. Claire moved forward slowly, the lantern casting wild shadows. Her breathing sounded loud in the enclosed space, and she became aware of her heartbeat, fast and strong. Not fear exactly, but heightened awareness, every sense alert. The corridor opened into a room. Not huge, maybe 15 feet square, but substantial, and it was furnished. Claire stopped in the doorway, lantern held high, trying to process what she was seeing. A cot against one wall, blankets still on it, though they looked rotted with age and damp. A small table and 2 chairs. Shelves along another wall, mostly empty but holding a few items she couldn't identify from this distance. A camping stove, a bucket, some kind of portable toilet. She realized, and against the far wall, a large trunk, metal with leather straps, the kind people used for travel in the early to mid-20th century. But what stopped her cold, what made her breath catch, was a wall above the trunk. Photographs, dozens of them, pinned directly to the concrete, some in frames, others just tacked up, and in the center, a map, not a topographical map or a road map, but a hand-drawn sketch of what looked like the surrounding area, with marks and notations she couldn't read from here. Claire stepped into the room, Gunnar following so close he bumped against her legs. She approached the wall slowly, raising the lantern to see better. The photographs were old, their colors faded to sepia tones. They showed people, A man and a woman, young, dressed in the style of the 1940s or early 50s. In some photos, they were together, arms around each other, smiling. In others, the man was alone, wearing what looked like a military uniform. Army, maybe, though Claire couldn't make out the insignia. But it was the woman in the photos who made Claire's hands start to shake. She knew that face. She'd seen it in family albums, in the few pictures her father had kept. That was her grandmother, Miriam Madsen, who had died in 1959, according to family history, who Claire had never known, who'd been gone before Claire's father was even 10 years old. But here she was, young and smiling, her arm around a man who definitely wasn't Claire's grandfather. Claire pulled one of the photographs from the wall, careful not to damage it, turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, Miriam and James, June 1951. June 1951. 1 year before her grandfather built this cabin. 1 year before he brought his new wife and young son to this remote mountain location. Claire's mind raced. Her grandfather, Edward Madsen, had built this cabin in 1952, right after he married Miriam. That was a family story. He'd been a logger, had made enough money to buy this land, had wanted to build something solid for his new family. But if these photos were from 1951, and this space existed under the cabin he'd built in 1952, then what was she looking at? Who was James? And why was there a room beneath her grandfather's cabin containing photographs of her grandmother with another man? Gunnar whined and moved the trunk, sniffing along its edges. Claire joined him, her hands trembling as she reached for the leather straps. They were stiff with age, but not locked. She undid them one by one and lifted the lid. Papers, stacks and stacks of papers, all carefully preserved in the dry underground air. Claire lifted out the first bundle and carried it to the table, set down the lantern, and began to read. Letters, dozens of them, addressed to Miriam Madsen, an address in Butte, Montana. The return address was from someone named James Creston at a military base in Germany. The dates ran from 1950 to 1951. Claire opened the first letter with shaking hands. My dearest Miriam, I know you asked me not to write, but I can't help myself. Even here, thousands of miles away, all I think about is you, about what we had, about what could have been if circumstances were different. I understand why you made the choice you did. Edward can give you stability, security, a future. I'm just a soldier with nothing but promises and uncertainty. You deserve more than that. You deserve everything. But I need you to know I will always love you. And if you ever change your mind, if you ever need me, I'll be there, no matter how much time has passed. No matter what's happened, I'll come back for you. Forever yours, James. Claire read the letter twice, then reached for the next one and the next. They told a story that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her family. Miriam had been engaged to James Creston. They'd been in love. But James had been deployed overseas, and while he was gone, Miriam had met Edward Madsen. Practical, stable, already building a life. She'd broken off her engagement to James and married Edward instead. But James had kept writing, kept hoping. And from the dates on the letters, he'd kept trying to reach her even after she was married, even after she'd moved to this remote mountain location. The last letter in the bundle was dated July 1952, 1 month after Edward built the cabin. Miriam, I came to Montana. I had to see you, had to know if you were happy. Edward wouldn't let me near you, said you didn't want to see me, that I needed to respect your choice and leave you alone. But I saw you through the window. Saw the bruise on your face. Saw how you flinched when he moved too quickly. I know what's happening, and I can't walk away. Not when you're in danger. I'm staying close. Edward doesn't know. No one knows. But I'm here, and I'll wait as long as it takes. When you're ready to leave, when you can't take it anymore, I'll be ready. The signal is still the same. The lamp in the window. 3 flashes. I'll see it, and I'll come. James. Claire set down the letter, her heart pounding. Her grandfather, the man she'd known as gentle and patient, who'd taught her to fish and track and love these mountains, had hurt her grandmother, had been violent with her. It didn't fit with the man she remembered. But the man she remembered had been in his 70s, mellowed by age and loss. What had he been like at 30, newly married, isolated on a remote mountain with a wife who'd chosen him for practical reasons rather than love? She reached for more papers from the trunk, found newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile. The first was from the Butte newspaper, dated September 1959. Local woman missing. Miriam Madsen, 32, wife of logger Edward Madsen, has been reported missing from the family's mountain home. Sheriff's deputies conducted a search of the area, but found no trace of Mrs. Madsen. Her husband reports she left the cabin on the morning of September 12th to gather berries and did not return. The terrain in the area is rough and dangerous, and authorities believe she may have fallen or become lost. The search continues. The next clipping was from 2 weeks later. Search called off for missing woman. After 2 weeks of intensive searching, authorities have called off the search for Miriam Madsen. Sheriff Robert Hayward stated that despite extensive efforts, no trace of Mrs. Madsen has been found. The mountains can be unforgiving, Hayward said. Sometimes people don't come back. Edward Madsen, the missing woman's husband, has returned to his logging work. The couple's 7-year-old son is staying with relatives in Butte. Claire's father. The 7-year-old son would have been her father, Thomas, who'd been told his mother had died in a tragic accident on the mountain, who'd never spoken much about her, who kept only a few photographs and seemed to carry a sadness about her loss that he'd never fully expressed. She reached deeper into the trunk and found a letter journal, its cover worn smooth. She opened it to the first page. This belongs to James Creston. If found after my death, please know I loved Miriam Madsen with everything I had. What happened wasn't her fault. It was mine for not acting sooner. Claire turned the page and began to read James Creston's account of what happened in the summer and fall of 1959. Section 3, the first reveal. James Creston had been living under the Madsen cabin for 7 years. That was the first revelation that made Claire sit down hard in one of the chairs, the journal trembling in her hands. 7 years of hiding in this underground room, watching, waiting for Miriam to signal that she needed help. He'd built it himself in the summer of 1952, while Edward was away at logging camps for weeks at a time. The cabin sat on pilings with crawl space beneath. Edward's designed to keep the structure off the wet ground. James had expanded that crawl space, digging deeper, pouring concrete using materials he carried in piece by piece from a supply depot 30 miles away. He'd worked at night, silently, compulsively, driven by the certainty that Miriam would eventually need rescue. August 15, 1952. The room is finished. Miriam doesn't know. No one knows. Edward thinks I left Montana, went back east. But I can't leave her. I see what he is now. Saw it in how he grabbed her arm, how he spoke to her when he thought no one was listening. She married him for security, but he's given her a prison instead. I watched the cabin from the ridge. I've learned their patterns. Edward leaves on Monday mornings for the logging camp, returns Friday nights. When he's gone, Miriam works in the garden, hangs laundry, moves more freely. When he's home, she becomes small, quiet, careful. I wait for the signal. 3 flashes from a lamp in the window. That's all it will take. I'll be ready. The entries continued, year after year. James documenting the slow deterioration of Miriam's spirit, the increasing control Edward exercised, the isolation he used as a weapon. March 3rd, 1954. Saw bruises on her arms today when she was hanging laundry. Dark purple, fingerprints. She covered them quickly when the boy came outside. Thomas, 7 years old now. Looks like his mother. I wonder what he understands about what's happening. I almost went to her today. Almost said to hell with waiting for a signal and just knocked on the door. But what would that accomplish? Edwards made sure everyone knows I'm a spurned lover, the unstable soldier who couldn't accept rejection. If I show up now, they'll say I'm harassing her, making things worse. So I wait, and I watch, and I hate myself for my cowardice. September 19th, 1956. Edward knows something. He's been more watchful lately, checking the woods around the cabin, securing the doors and windows more carefully. Has Miriam said something? Has she given some sign that she's thinking about leaving? Or has he somehow sensed me? Found some evidence of my presence? I'm more careful now. Only come out at night. Keep my movements minimal. The supplies I'd stockpiled are running low. But I can't risk trips to town. Can't risk being seen. This can't last forever. Something has to break. Claire turned pages, reading faster now, driven by the need to understand how this impossible situation had ended. A man living under a cabin for 7 years, watching the woman he loved suffer, unable or unwilling to intervene. Her grandmother, trapped in a marriage that had become a cage, too frightened or too practical to ask for help. And then, September 1959, the entry that changed everything. September 11th, 1959. Tonight, finally, after all these years, I saw it. 3 flashes from the lamp in the window. The signal. Miriam is ready. She wants to leave. I waited until 2 a.m., when I was certain Edward was deeply asleep. Climbed up through the access hatch I'd built into their bedroom closet. The one place Edward never looked because he was too certain of his control to imagine anyone could reach her here. She was waiting, dressed in traveling clothes, a small bag packed. Her face, God, her face. A fresh bruise on her cheek, her lips split. He'd hit her harder than usual. That's what finally pushed her to signal. We climbed down together into my hiding place. She saw what I'd built, what I'd been living in for 7 years, and she started crying. You shouldn't have stayed, she said. You should have lived your life. But I couldn't, not while she was suffering, not while there was a chance. We planned it carefully. We'd wait until morning when Edward left for his logging shift. Then we'd hike out, take the trail that led east toward the next valley. By the time Edward came home and found her gone, we'd be hours ahead of him, far enough that even if he looked, he wouldn't find us. Tomorrow we'll be free. Tomorrow, finally, we can start the life we should have had. Claire turned the page, dreading what she knew was coming, because her grandmother hadn't left. According to family history, she'd died, had disappeared while gathering berries, and never been found. September 12, 1959. Everything went wrong. Edward didn't leave this morning. Said he was feeling ill, would skip his shift. Miriam and I waited in the underground room, barely breathing, hoping he'd change his mind. But he didn't. He stayed home. Around noon, he called down to Miriam. Said he was hungry. Where was his lunch? She had to answer. Had to go up or he'd come looking. We decided she'd tell him she'd been in the outhouse. Hadn't heard him calling. She climbed up to the hatch. So brave, so determined to keep him from discovering where she'd really been. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Then I heard it. Raised voices. Edward shouting. The sound of something breaking. Miriam screaming. I climbed up through the hatch, instinct overriding caution. Burst through the closet into their bedroom. Edward had Miriam by the throat, slamming her against the wall. Her face was purple, eyes bulging. He was going to kill her. I didn't think. I grabbed him, pulled him off her. He turned on me, shocked, and raged. You, he said, you've been here. All this time, you've been here. We fought. Years of rage and frustration and helplessness poured out of me. I was younger, stronger, trained by the military, but he was wild with betrayal and fury. Miriam tried to stop us, screaming for us to stop, crying, begging. In the chaos, she stumbled backward, lost her balance, fell, her head at the corner of the stone fireplace. The sound, God, the sound. She dropped like a puppet with cut strings, blood spreading across the floor. We both stopped, stared at her. Edward's face went white. What have you done? He whispered. But it wasn't me who killed her. It was the fighting, the chaos, the years of violence and fear that had led to this moment. She was dead before either of us could reach her. Neck broken, dead. The next entry was dated 2 days later. James's handwriting was shaky, barely legible. September 14th, 1959. Edward called the sheriff. Reported Miriam missing. Said she'd gone out to gather berries and never came back. The sheriff organized a search. I watched from the ridge as they combed the forest, They won't find her. Can't find her. Because Edward and I buried her together. That's the deal we made. Standing over her body. Both of us guilty. Both of us trapped by what happened. He said he'd report her missing. Let everyone believe she'd gotten lost or fallen somewhere in the woods. He said if I ever told anyone what really happened, he'd say I killed her, that I'd been stalking her for years, that I'd broken in and attacked them both. It would be his word against mine, and he was a respectable husband while I was the obsessed ex-lover. I couldn't let Miriam be remembered that way. Couldn't let her death become a scandal. So I agreed. We buried her deep in the forest, in a place only we will ever know. Edward said a prayer. I said goodbye. And then we became partners in silence. Edward told his son that his mother was dead, sent the boy to live with relatives, closed up the cabin, and went back to his logging work. And I stayed here, in this room, because I have nowhere else to go. Because I killed the woman I loved as surely as if I'd pushed her myself. Because I deserve this prison I built. The remaining entries grew sparse, months passing between them. James documenting his slow deterioration, his growing illness, his acceptance of what he'd become. The final entry was dated January 1962. I'm dying. Lung cancer, probably. Can't breathe right anymore. Pain is constant. I won't leave this room. This is where I'll die. In the place I built to save Miriam. The place that became my tomb instead. If anyone ever finds this, know that I love her. Know that I'm sorry. Know that sometimes love isn't enough to save anyone. Tell Thomas his mother tried to leave. Tell him she was brave. Don't let him think she chose the woods over him. She chose freedom. It's not her fault she never got to have it. James Creston, January 18th, 1962. Claire closed the journal, her hand shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. Gunnar pressed against her leg, whining softly, sensing her distress. Her grandmother hadn't died gathering berries. She died trying to escape. And her grandfather, the man Claire had loved, had trusted, had thought she knew, had buried her body and lied about it for the rest of his life. And beneath his cabin, hidden in the room James Creston had built, another body had lain for over 60 years. Because James had promised not to tell, had accepted his own imprisonment as penance for his role in Miriam's death. Claire stood on shaking legs and moved back to the trunk. If James had died here in 1962, his body should still be, she saw it then, in the corner she hadn't fully explored. A sleeping bag, rotted and collapsed, and inside it bones. Clothing deteriorated but intact enough to show it had been a man's outfit from the 1960s. A skull, empty eye socket staring at nothing. James Creston had kept his promise. He'd never left this room. He'd died here, alone, maintaining the silence that protected Miriam's memory and Thomas's innocence. Claire backed away, her mind reeling. She needed to get out of this space, needed air and sunlight and the freedom to think clearly about what she'd found. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight beam caught something else. Another opening in the far wall, partially hidden behind the shelves. A second corridor, leading deeper into the earth. There was more. Whatever her grandfather and James Creston had been hiding, it wasn't just a tragic accident and a buried secret. There was something else down here, something that extended beyond a single room. Gunnar moved toward the opening, tail low, ears back. He didn't want to go that direction. Neither did Claire. But she knew with cold certainty that she couldn't leave. Not until she understood everything. Not until she knew the whole truth about what had happened here. She checked her phone. No signal, as expected, but still plenty of battery. Her lantern was still strong. She had water, supplies, and enough light to continue exploring. All right, she said to Gunnar, her voice steadier than she felt. Let's see what else they were hiding. She stepped over James Creston's remains, whispered an apology to the bones of a man who'd loved too desperately and paid too high a price, and moved toward the dark corridor that promised more secrets still. The second corridor was narrower than the first and older. Claire could see the difference immediately. The walls here weren't smooth-poured concrete, but rough-hewn stone, fitted together with mortar that had begun to crumble in places. This passage predated James Creston's room, predated the cabin itself, possibly by decades. Her grandfather hadn't built this. He'd found it. The corridor descended at a gentle angle, going deeper into the mountain. Claire moved slowly, one hand on the wall for balance, the lantern held high in the other. Gunnar followed close enough that she could feel his breath on the back of her leg, his reluctance evident in every step. After 20 feet, the passage opened into another chamber. This one was larger than James's room, maybe 30 feet across, and it was full. Crates, dozens of wooden crates, stacked against the walls, some rotted and collapsed, others still intact. Metal containers, what looked like old ammunition boxes, and against the far wall, a workbench with tools still laid out on its surface, as if someone had just stepped away and planned to return. Claire approached the nearest crate and examined it in the lantern light, stenciled on the side in faded paint. U.S. Army, Fort Harrison, 1945. Her breath caught. 1945, the end of World War II. 7 years before her grandfather built the cabin. 17 years before James Creston died in the room above. She set down the lantern and tried to pry open the crate. The wood was old but still solid, nails rusted but holding. She went to the workbench and found a crowbar. It felt obscene using tools that had probably been touched last by her grandfather, but she needed to know what was inside. The lid came away with a screech of protesting metal. Claire lifted the lantern and looked inside. Guns, military rifles, carefully packed in grease paper, preserved against moisture and time. She counted 6 of them, all identical, all appearing to be M1 Garands, the standard U.S. infantry rifle from World War II. She moved to the next crate. More guns. The next contained ammunition, boxes and boxes of it, still sealed. Another held what looked like explosives, dynamite, she thought, though she was no expert. The labels were faded, but the warning symbols were still clear enough. Her grandfather had been storing military weapons and explosives under his cabin. For over 70 years, this arsenal had sat beneath the place where she'd spent summer vacations, where she'd learned to love the mountains, where she felt safe and innocent and completely unaware of what lay beneath her feet. Why? Why would Edward Madsen, a logger, have a stockpile of military weapons? Claire moved systematically through the room, opening crates and containers, documenting what she found with her phone's camera, even though she had no signal to send the images anywhere. The inventory was staggering. At least 40 rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, 50 sticks of dynamite, remarkably well-preserved military-grade radio equipment from the 1940s medical supplies, in sealed metal containers rations. Still in their original packaging, dated 1944-1945 maps of the surrounding mountain region, marked with locations and coordinates a locked metal box she couldn't open without tools. This wasn't just a random collection. This was deliberate, organized, systematic. This was a cache, a military cache, hidden in a remote mountain location, forgotten or deliberately left behind. And her grandfather had found it, or had known about it, or had been part of whatever operation had put it here in the first place. Claire's mind raced through possibilities. During World War II, the military had maintained secret installations throughout the American West, ammunition depots, training facilities, emergency caches in case of invasion or sabotage. After the war ended, some of these installations had been decommissioned, their contents destroyed or moved. But some had simply been forgotten, their locations lost to bureaucratic confusion or deliberate secrecy. Had this been one of those forgotten caches? Had her grandfather stumbled across it when he bought the land in 1952? Or had he known about it before? Had that knowledge been why he chose this particular location to build his cabin? She thought about James Creston's journal, his comment that Edward had seemed more watchful in the mid-1950s, checking the woods, securing the cabin more carefully. Had Edward been protecting this cache? Had he been worried that James, living under the cabin, coming and going at night, might discover it? And more importantly, had James discovered it? Was that why he'd been allowed to die here, rather than being forced out or reported to authorities? Had Edward needed James to stay hidden because James knew too much? Claire pulled out James's journal again and flipped through it more carefully, looking for references she might have missed. Found an entry from November 1956. Edward's been bringing men to the cabin. Late at night, when he thinks no one's watching. They arrive in trucks with no markings, carry heavy crates inside. I can hear them moving around above me, talking in low voices. I couldn't make out much of the conversation, but I heard enough. Something about inventory and buyers and no paper trail. I think Edward's selling something. Something he doesn't want anyone to know about. That was a connection. Edward hadn't just found a forgotten military cache. He'd been selling it, piece by piece, quietly, over years or decades. Selling military weapons and explosives to buyers who didn't ask questions. And James had figured it out. Claire sat down heavily on an intact crate, the implications flooding through her. Her grandfather had been running an illegal arms operation from this remote mountain location. That's why he'd chosen such an isolated place. That's why he'd been so controlling with Miriam. He couldn't risk her talking to neighbors, couldn't risk anyone getting curious about what he was doing. And when James Creston had showed up, when James had built his hiding place under the cabin and started his 7-year vigil, Edward must have been terrified that his operation would be discovered. He couldn't get rid of James without raising suspicions, couldn't report him to authorities without inviting scrutiny of his own activities. So they'd existed in this strange détente. James hiding in his underground room, Edward living above him, both of them trapped by their secrets. Until Miriam tried to leave, and everything fell apart. Claire thought about her father, sent away to live with relatives after his mother's death. Had he ever known? Had Edward told him anything before he died in 2003? Or had her father spent his whole life believing his father was a simple, honest logger who'd lost his wife to a tragic accident? She remembered her father's relationship with this cabin. He'd maintained it faithfully, came up every summer to check on things, make repairs. But he'd never spent much time here, never brought Claire's mother, never suggested they make it a family vacation spot beyond Claire's brief childhood visits. Had he sensed something? Known something he couldn't articulate? Gunnar whined and pawed at her leg, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked down at him and realized he was trying to get her attention, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the chamber. "What is it, boy?" He moved away from her, toward the corner, and began sniffing intently at what looked like a pile of collapsed crates. Then he started digging, his powerful legs sending up clouds of dust and debris. "Gunnar, stop." But he didn't stop. He dug with the same intensity he'd shown at the cabin's foundation, the same certainty that something important lay hidden. Claire grabbed a lantern and approached. As Gunnar cleared away rotted wood and debris, she saw what had caught his attention. Bones. Human bones, partially buried beneath the collapsed crates. Not James Creston. Those remains were in the room above. This was someone else. Someone who'd been down here long enough for the body to decompose completely, for the clothing to rot away to almost nothing. Claire knelt and brushed away more debris with shaking hands. The skeleton was largely intact, lying on its side as if the person had fallen or been placed here. The skull showed a distinctive break, a fracture that suggested trauma, violence. Near the skeletal hand, she found something that made her blood run cold. A wallet, leather rotted but still holding its basic shape. She opened it carefully and found the contents remarkably preserved, protected by the leather and the dry underground air. An ID card laminated, faded but legible. Robert Crane, Federal Bureau of Investigation issued. 1958. FBI. There was a dead FBI agent in her grandfather's underground weapons cache. Claire sat back, her mind reeling. An FBI agent, dead since at least 1958, hidden beneath collapsed crates in a secret chamber that her grandfather had been using to run an illegal arms operation. The implications were staggering. The FBI had been investigating. Someone, this Robert Crane, had discovered what Edward Madsen was doing, and Edward had killed him, had buried him here, hidden him beneath the very weapons he'd been investigating. And then a year later, Miriam had died. James had died. The cabin had been closed up, and Edward had moved away, only returning occasionally to maintain the property and, presumably, to continue his illegal sales at a much more careful pace. How many others had there been? How many other people had discovered Edward's secret and disappeared? Claire pulled out her phone and took photographs of everything: the skeleton, the ID card, the surrounding crates. She needed evidence, needed documentation. When she finally got out of here, she'd need to go to authorities, and she'd need proof of what she'd found. But even as she documented, a darker thought occurred to her. This cache existed under a cabin now, on her property. If she reported this, if she brought authorities here, what would happen? Would she face charges for possessing illegal weapons? Would they take the property? Would her grandfather's crimes become her legal nightmare? And more pressingly, if Edward had been selling from this cache for decades, who had his buyers been? Were they still out there? Still connected to this location? Still expecting to have access to what remained? She thought about the 11 months she'd spent here in isolation. No visitors, no contact with anyone, except occasional supply runs to the small town 40 miles down the mountain. She thought she was alone, thought she was safe in her grief and her solitude. But what if she hadn't been alone? What if someone had been watching, waiting to see if she'd discover what lay beneath the cabin? What if her presence here had disrupted something that was supposed to remain undisturbed? Gunnar growled suddenly, low and threatening, a sound she'd never heard from him before. His attention was fixed on a corridor they'd entered through, his body tense. Claire grabbed a lantern and stood quickly. What is it? Then she heard it. Footsteps. Someone was descending the stone stairs into the underground complex. Someone else knew about this place, and they were coming. Section 5, the deeper secret. Claire killed the lantern instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness. Her heart hammered so hard she was certain whoever was coming could hear it. Beside her, Gunnar's growl had gone silent, but she could feel his body coiled and ready, waiting for her command. The footsteps were careful, measured, not running, not hurrying. Someone who knew this place, who'd been here before, someone comfortable in the darkness. A light appeared in the corridor, a flashlight beam cutting through the black. Claire pressed herself against the wall behind a stack of crates, pulling Gunnar close. The dog trembled against her leg but held silent, his training overriding his protective instincts. The footsteps entered the chamber. The flashlight beam swept across the room, taking inventory. Then a voice, male, weathered by age and cigarettes. I know someone's been down here. The hatch was opened. Fresh disturbance in James's room. A pause. Might as well come out. This ends easier if we talk. Claire's mind raced. She had no weapon, no way out except past this person. The corridor behind her led only deeper into the mountain. She'd seen no other exits. She was trapped with a dead FBI agent, a cache of illegal weapons, and someone who clearly didn't want this place discovered. Her hand found Gunnar's collar, holding him steady. She had one advantage. They didn't know exactly where she was in the chamber, didn't know about the dog. The voice came again, closer now. Look, I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because I got an alert. Security system I installed picks up when the hatch opens. I came to check it out, see if it was animals or kids or... The beam swung toward her hiding place. Or someone who owns a property and has questions. Something in the tone suggested he wasn't an immediate threat, not an armed buyer come to protect his investment. More like, what? A guardian? Someone watching over this place? Claire made a decision. She turned on her lantern, the sudden light making both of them blink. The man jumped, his flashlight beam whipping toward her, but he didn't draw a weapon, didn't attack. He was old, 70 at least, probably older, tall but stooped, wearing canvas work pants and a heavy flannel jacket, gray hair military short, face weathered by decades of mountain weather, and in his eyes, something Claire recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror for the past 11 months. Guilt, bone deep, soul wearing guilt. You must be Edward's granddaughter, he said. Claire, right? Your father talked about you. Who are you? Name's Michael Torres. I knew your grandfather. Worked with him, you could say. He gestured at the chamber around them. I was his partner in this enterprise for about 15 years, back in the 80s and 90s. Claire kept her hand on Gunnar's collar. You helped him sell military weapons illegally. I did. No denial, no justification. Just acknowledgement. I'm not proud of it, but I did it. There's a dead FBI agent over there, Claire said, pointing with her free hand. Did you help with that too? Torres's face went pale. FBI? No. I. He moved toward where she was pointing, showing his flashlight on the skeletal remains. Jesus Christ. Robert Crane. We always wondered what happened to him. You knew him? Knew of him. In '58, word got around that the FBI was poking into illegal weapon sales in Montana, asking questions about old military caches, looking for connections to anti-government groups and survivalists. Your grandfather got spooked, shut down operations for a while. Then Crane disappeared, and the investigation went quiet. We figured he'd been reassigned, or... Torres looked at the bones. Or this. My grandfather killed him. Looks that way. Torres moved back, keeping his distance from the remains. I didn't know. You have to believe that. I knew Edward was ruthless when he needed to be. Knew he'd done things during the war that haunted him. But I didn't know about this. What things during the war? Torres sighed and sat down heavily on a crate, suddenly looking every one of 70-plus years. You really want the whole story? Yes. Then you better sit down, too. This is going to take a while. Claire didn't sit, but she loosened her grip on Gunner slightly. The dog had calmed, sensing perhaps that Torres was an immediate threat. She waited. Torres pulled out a pack of cigarettes, then seemed to think better of it in the enclosed space. Your grandfather, Edward Madsen, he wasn't a logger. Not originally. He was Army, World War II, served in Europe, then got reassigned to a classified operation in the Pacific Northwest in the last year of the war. What kind of operation? The kind nobody talked about then, and that's still classified now. The U.S. was preparing for the possibility of Japanese invasion. Seemed far-fetched, but command took it seriously. They established secret caches throughout the West. Weapons, ammunition, supplies, places resistance fighters could access if the Japanese landed and pushed inland. This was one of those caches. One of dozens. Edward was part of the team that established and maintained them. When the war ended and the caches were decommissioned, Edward was assigned to help with dismantling operations. But some caches, like this one, were in such remote locations that the Army decided it was more cost-effective to just seal them up and forget about them. Too expensive to haul everything out, and nobody was likely to find them anyway. Except my grandfather knew where this one was. He did. And in 1952, when he mustered out of the Army, he came back, bought the land, built his cabin directly on top of the cache. And over the next 50 years, he sold off the contents piece by piece to buyers who didn't ask where it came from. Claire thought about the scope of what Torres was describing. That's a lot of weapons. Who was buying? Survivalists mostly. Militia groups. Some legitimate collectors who didn't care about provenance. A few foreign buyers. Small-time arms dealers who moved stuff to conflicts in Central America, Africa. Your grandfather didn't ask questions, and they didn't volunteer information. And you helped him do this. Torres nodded slowly. I did. I was Army too, served in Vietnam. Came back screwed up, couldn't hold a job, couldn't get my head right. Edward gave me work, gave me purpose. I knew what we were doing was illegal, but I told myself we were just moving old equipment that would have rusted away otherwise, that we weren't hurting anyone. Until the FBI started investigating. That was when I should have walked away, when I knew it had gone too far. But I didn't. Torres looked at her directly. I was a coward. I needed the money, and I was scared of what Edward would do if I tried to leave. So I stayed, and I kept my head down, and I pretended I didn't know what happened to Robert Crane. Did you know about James Creston? About the man who lived under cabin for 7 years. Torres's expression shifted to surprise. What? Claire told him. About James's room, his journal, his 7-year vigil waiting to rescue Miriam. About the accidental death, and the 2 men's pact of silence. About James dying alone in his underground prison, while Edward continued his illegal operation overhead. When she finished, Torres was pale. I knew Edward's wife died. Knew it was suspicious. People don't just vanish gathering berries. But I figured it was domestic violence gone too far, and that wasn't my business. I didn't know about James. Didn't know anyone was living down here. How could you not know? You were his partner. I didn't start working with Edward until 1981. By then, James had been dead almost 20 years. And Edward never let me come here when he wasn't present. We'd meet in town or at different locations for deliveries, but the cabin was off limits. Said it was his private space, his sanctuary. I respected that. Claire studied Torres's face, trying to decide if she believed him. He seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations about James and Miriam, genuinely disturbed by the FBI agent's remains. But he'd also admitted to 15 years of illegal activity. How much could she trust anything he said? "Why are you still watching this place?" she asked. "Edward died over 20 years ago. Why keep monitoring the hatch?" "Because there's still inventory here. And because there are still people who know about this location who might come looking. I promised Edward before he died that I'd watch over it, make sure it stayed hidden." "Why would you promise that?" Torres looked away. "Because Edward had something on me. Evidence of my involvement that would send me to prison. He said if I kept watch, made sure nothing was disturbed, he'd keep that evidence sealed. But if anything happened, if authorities found this place, if anyone started asking questions, he'd make sure I went down too. He's dead. That threat died with him." "Did it?" Torres met her eyes again. "What happens when you report this, Claire? When you call the police and show them a dead FBI agent and enough illegal weapons to start a small war? They'll investigate everyone connected to Edward. They'll dig into family connections, business associates. And eventually they'll find me, and they'll find the documentation Edward kept on everything I did for him. I'll die in prison. So you're asking me not to report it. I'm asking you to think carefully about what reporting it means. For you, for me, for your family's reputation. Your father never knew about any of this. Edward kept him completely in the dark. Your grandmother died trying to escape. James Creston died because he loved the wrong woman. Do you really want all that dragged into public view? Want your grandfather remembered as a murderer and arms dealer?" Claire's hands tightened into fists. "He was a murderer and arms dealer. That's the truth." "Truth and justice aren't always the same thing," Torres said quietly. "Sometimes protecting the innocent means burying the truth." That's exactly what Edward thought. And it led to more death, more secrets, more poison. Before Torres could respond, Gunner's head snapped toward the corridor entrance. His lips pulled back from his teeth, a silent snarl. Someone else was coming. Torres stood quickly. "Did you tell anyone you'd found this place?" "No. I've been alone here for 11 months. "Then who?" The answer came in the form of voices, multiple voices, echoing down the corridor, and then flashlight beams sweeping toward them. Torres grabbed Claire's arm. "We need to hide. Now." "Why?" "Who are they?" "Buyers," Torres hissed. "I told you people still know about this location. They've been patient, waiting for me to give the signal that it's safe to make another purchase. But if they know the hatch is open, if they think someone's discovered the cash..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Claire understood. These weren't going to be friendly collectors willing to talk. These were people with financial stake in keeping this place secret. People who'd kill to protect their supply line. Torres pulled her deeper into the chamber, behind the stacked crates where she'd first hidden. Gunner followed, his body vibrating with barely contained aggression. "How many?" Claire whispered. "I don't know, but they'll be armed, and they'll shoot first if they think this operation's been compromised." The voices grew louder. 3 men, maybe 4, talking in low tones about checking the inventory and seeing what's left. They entered the chamber, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Claire pressed herself against the cold stone wall and prayed that Gunner would stay quiet. Her phone was in her pocket. But even if she'd had signal, she couldn't call for help without alerting the men to her presence. She was trapped in an underground weapons cache with a dead FBI agent, a man who'd helped run an illegal operation for 15 years, and an unknown number of armed buyers who had every reason to want anyone who discovered this place dead. And somewhere above them, her cabin sat peaceful and empty in the Montana wilderness, no one knowing she was down here, no one coming to help. Section 6. The threat escalates. The three men who entered the chamber were younger than Torres, maybe in their 40s or 50s. They moved with military precision, sweeping their weapons, rifles. Claire saw with horror in coordinated patterns. These weren't casual gun enthusiasts. These were professionals. Torres at the hatch was opened. One of them said, his voice rough and commanding. He was the biggest of the three, wearing tactical gear that looked too professional for civilians. But he didn't say why. Maybe animals, another offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Animals don't move the locking stone. Someone's been here. The big man swept his flashlight across the chamber, the beam passing within inches of Claire's hiding place. Question is whether they're still here or if they ran. Claire's hand found Gunner's muzzle, holding it gently closed. The dog was trembling, every instinct telling him to protect her, but he held still. Good boy. Brave boy. Beside her, Torres was barely breathing. In the dim, reflected light, she could see sweat on his forehead despite the underground chill. The third man, shorter, compact, with the fluid movement of someone combat-trained, approached the collapsed crates where Robert Crane's remains lay. Hey, there's something over here. Looks like Jesus is at a body. The big man moved quickly to join him. There was a long pause as they examined the skeleton. Then, badge, FBI. How long you think this has been here? Decades, from the looks of it. This is old. Does Torres know about this? If he does, he never mentioned it. The big man straightened, his voice turning hard. We got a problem. If Torres has been sitting on a dead federal agent all these years, he's more of a liability than we thought. And if he didn't know, then someone else has been using this cash. Someone we don't know about. So what do? We secure the inventory, move what we can, and we have a conversation with Torres about proper disclosure. The big man's tone made it clear what kind of conversation he meant. Nobody keeps secrets in this operation. Not anymore. The margins are too thin, and the risks are too high. Claire felt Torres tense beside her. His breathing had become audible, ragged. These men weren't his partners. They were his threat. Whatever arrangement he'd had with her grandfather, it had evolved into something more dangerous. Check the rest of the chamber. The big man ordered, make sure we're alone. The two younger men split up, beginning a systematic search. They were thorough, professional, checking behind every stack of crates, every pile of equipment. It was only a matter of time before they found Claire's hiding place. She looked at Torres, saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. He mouthed something, I'm sorry. The shorter man was moving toward them, his flashlight beam swinging closer. 20 feet away. 15. 10. Gunner's body coiled tight. Claire knew that stance. He was about to attack, about to launch himself at the perceived threat regardless of the gun the man was carrying. She had seconds to make a decision. Let Gunner attack, and hope the chaos gave them a chance to escape. Try to run now, before they were discovered. Or, she stood up. The movement was so sudden, so unexpected, that for a crucial second all three men froze. Claire stepped out from behind the crates, hands raised, deliberately non-threatening. Gunner moved with her, positioning himself between Claire and the armed men, his stance aggressive but controlled. Don't shoot, Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm the property owner. I live in the cabin above. The big man recovered first, his rifle coming up to point at her chest. Who are you? Claire Madsen. Edward Madsen was my grandfather. This is my land. The three men exchanged glances. The big man's weapon didn't lower, but his finger eased off the trigger. Torres, get out here. Torres emerged from behind the crates, hands also raised. I can explain. Shut up. We'll deal with you later. The big man focused on Claire. How long have you known about this cache? I found it this morning. My dog was digging at the foundation, and I found the hatch. And you decided to come down here alone? In the dark? Into a hidden underground chamber? That's either very brave or very stupid. I wanted to know what was under my cabin. Now you know. Question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? Claire's mind raced. These men were deciding right now whether she was a threat, that needed eliminating or someone who could be managed. Every word she said in the next minute would determine whether she lived or died. "I'm not going to the police," she said. "I have no interest in having federal agents swarming my property or having my grandfather's crimes made public. I just want to live here in peace." "And you expect us to believe that? To just trust that you'll keep quiet about illegal weapons, a dead FBI agent, and an active trafficking operation? I've been living here for almost a year. Alone. No visitors, minimal contact with town. If I wanted attention, I'd have people up here constantly. I came to this mountain to be left alone, not to get involved in whatever this is." The big man studied her, clearly weighing her words. "What about Torres?" "What about him? He's been watching this place for 20 years. Did you know that? Did he tell you he's been monitoring your property, reporting your movements to us?" Claire glanced at Torres, who had the decency to look ashamed. "No, he just told me he worked with my grandfather. He worked for your grandfather. Now he works for us. And if he failed to report that someone had discovered this location, that's a serious breach of protocol." Torres found his voice. "I was trying to handle it quietly. Didn't want to involve everyone until I knew what we were dealing with. That wasn't your call to make." The big man's attention returned to Claire. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back upstairs, close the hatch, and forget this place exists. We're going to move the remaining inventory tonight. Clear out everything. Seal this chamber permanently. Then there's nothing here but empty rooms and old ghosts. Everyone walks away clean. And if I don't agree, then we have a problem. And problems get solved permanently." The threat was clear. Claire looked at the three armed men, at Torres, standing helpless and guilty, at Gunner ready to die protecting her. She thought about James Creston dying alone for love, about her grandmother dying trying to escape, about an FBI agent who'd probably thought he was close to breaking a major case before he disappeared. This place was poison. Everything connected to it died or became corrupted. Her grandfather had built his entire life on violence and secrets, and everyone who'd gotten close had paid the price. But she wasn't her grandfather, and she wasn't going to let more violence bury more truth. "I need time to think," she said carefully. "This is a lot to process. I just found out my grandfather was a murderer and an arms dealer. I need time. Time isn't something we have a lot of," the big man said. "We move tonight. You need to decide right now whether you're going to be a problem." "I won't be a problem," Claire said, hating herself for the lie but knowing survival required it. "I'll go upstairs. I'll close the hatch. I'll pretend I never found this." "Smart." The big man lowered his weapon slightly. "Torres, you escort her up. Make sure she understands the seriousness of keeping quiet. Then get back down here. We got work to do." Torres nodded and moved toward Claire. As he passed, his eyes met hers, pleading for what? Forgiveness? Understanding? Help? Claire turned and walked toward the corridor, Gunner at her heel. Every step felt like surrender, like betrayal of everyone who died in this place. But she needed to get out, needed to reach her phone, needed to figure out what to do next. They climbed through James Creston's room, Torres averting his eyes from the remains in the corner, and up the stone stairs toward the hatch opening. Daylight streamed down, achingly bright after the underground darkness. At the top, Torres grabbed her arm gently. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never wanted anyone else to get hurt. How are you going to stop them from killing me? The second I'm alone up here, what's to keep them from coming back?" "They won't. It's not worth it. You've agreed to keep quiet. They're moving the inventory. As far as they're concerned, problem solved." "You really believe that?" Torres's silence was answer enough. Claire climbed out a hatch, Gunner scrambling up beside her. The mountain air felt like freedom, cool and clean and alive. The sun was past noon now. She'd been underground for hours, though it felt like days. "Close it," Torres said from below. "Put the stone back. Try to live your life. Claire, some things are better left buried." She looked down at him, this old man who'd spent decades protecting someone else's crimes, who'd become complicit in murder through his silence and cowardice. "Did my father know?" she asked. "Before he died, did he know what his father really was?" No, Edward kept him innocent. It was the one decent thing he did. Claire nodded slowly. What about my grandmother's body? Where did they bury her? Torres's face twisted with something that might have been grief or guilt. I don't know. Edward never told me. Said it was better if that secret died with him. It didn't die. Secrets never do. They just poison the ground until someone digs them up. She lowered the hatch, cutting off Torres's view of the daylight, placed the locking stone back in position, and then she stood in her grandfather's clearing, Gunner pressing against her leg, and tried to figure out how she was going to survive the night. Because Torres was right about one thing. Those men weren't going to let her live. They couldn't afford to. She was a witness to their operation, knew about the cash, had seen their faces. The smart play, the only play that made sense from their perspective, was to eliminate the threat, which meant Claire had maybe hours before they came back. Hours to decide whether to run or fight. Hours to figure out if there was any way to stop what her grandfather had started 70 years ago. She looked at the cabin, her refuge for 11 months, the place she'd come to hide from grief and pain. It sat peaceful in the afternoon sun, beautiful and innocent looking, but beneath it lay death and weapons and decades of corruption. Just like beneath her own careful numbness lay all the grief and rage and fear she'd been avoiding since Paul died. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to face what needed facing, no matter how painful. Claire pulled out her phone and checked it compulsively, even though she knew there was no signal. She needed to get down the mountain, needed to reach town, needed to contact authorities while there was still time. But even as she thought it, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching on the rough forest road. Too soon for the men to have finished moving inventory. Too soon for anything except a truck appeared through the trees. Not one of the armed men's vehicles. This was older, civilian, familiar. It pulled into the clearing and stopped. The driver's door opened, and a woman in her 60s climbed out. She was small, weathered by mountain life, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore Ranger greens, Forest Service uniform. Claire Madsen, the woman called. I'm Ranger Patricia Dawson. I need to talk to you about your property. Claire's hand tightened on Gunner's collar. Had the armed men called the Forest Service? Was this some kind of setup? What about it? She called back, not moving from the hatch site. We've been conducting a survey of old military installations in this region, checking for environmental contamination, unexploded ordnance, that sort of thing. And according to our records, there's a decommissioned cache somewhere on or near your property. I was hoping I could have your permission to search for it. Claire stared at the ranger, her mind reeling. This was too much coincidence. First she discovers a cache, then armed men show up. Now the Forest Service is asking about military installations? Unless someone had finally come looking for what her grandfather had stolen. Unless after 70 years, the government wanted to know what had happened to their weapons. And if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, Claire had found a way to survive this night after all. Claire made a split-second decision. She'd spent 11 months running from connection, from truth, from everything that hurt. But standing here now, with armed criminals below ground and a federal ranger in front of her, she realized that some battles chose you whether you were ready or not. There's a cache under my cabin, she said, walking toward Ranger Dawson. And there are armed men down there, right now planning to move the inventory tonight. Also, there's a dead FBI agent from 1958. To Dawson's credit, she didn't flinch. Her hand moved to her radio. But she didn't reach for the weapon at her hip. How many armed men? 3 that I saw. Maybe more. They came about 20 minutes ago. There's also a man named Michael Torres who used to work with my grandfather running illegal weapons sales from a cache. Your grandfather? Edward Madsen. He built this cabin in 1952 directly on top of a World War II weapons cache. He's been selling from it for over 70 years. The FBI tried to investigate in 1958, but their agent disappeared. Claire gestured toward the hatch. He's down there. They killed him. Dawson's expression had gone hard and professional. She spoke into her radio, low and quick, calling for backup, county sheriff, state police, federal agents. Then she focused back on Claire. You went down there alone? I didn't know what I was finding. My dog kept digging at the foundation. I thought maybe it was a root cellar or old mining works. And you're sure there are 3 armed men down there now? At least 3. They're professional, military training, tactical gear. They were checking inventory when I left. When you left, they let you leave? Claire nodded. They think I've agreed to keep quiet. That I'll pretend I never found this place. But they're not going to let me live. Torres admitted as much. They can't afford witnesses. Dawson studied Claire's face, making some calculation. Backup is at least 45 minutes out. This is remote even by Montana standards. If those men decide to move inventory and eliminate threats before authorities arrive, we have a problem. Can you arrest them? I'm Forest Service, not law enforcement. I'm armed, but I'm not trained for tactical situations against multiple hostiles. Dawson pulled out her phone, checked it, grimaced. No signal. We're too deep in the valley. There's a ridge about a mile north, Claire said. Sometimes I can get 1 bar up there. Show me. They moved quickly through the forest, gunner ranging ahead. Claire's mind was racing through possibilities, through what came next. The armed men would finish their inventory check, realize the scope of what they were dealing with, and then they'd come looking for her. Torres might try to warn her, might try to help, but he was 1 old man against 3 professionals. At the ridge, Dawson's phone found signal. She made calls short, professional, urgent. Claire could hear fragments. Armed suspects, federal crime scene, possible hostage situation. The machinery of law enforcement grinding into motion, but too slow, too far away. When Dawson finished, she looked at Claire grimly. County sheriff is 40 minutes out. State police are an hour. FBI is sending a team from Missoula, but that's 2 hours minimum. So we're alone. For now. Dawson checked her weapon. A Glock 17, standard Forest Service issue. Do you have any firearms in your cabin? A rifle. My grandfather's old hunting rifle. And a shotgun. Get them. Load them. If those men come for you before backup arrives, you defend yourself. Understand? Claire nodded, her mouth dry. She'd been shooting since she was 12. Her grandfather had taught her, ironically enough, but target practice and hunting were different from pointing a weapon at another human being with intent to kill. They headed back toward the cabin. As they approached the clearing, Claire saw that the hatch was still closed, the locking stone still in place. No sign of disturbance. But that wouldn't last. Inside, Claire retrieved the rifles from where her grandfather had kept them in a locked cabinet. The hunting rifle was a Remington 700, .30-06 caliber, well-maintained despite its age. The shotgun was a Mossberg 500, 12-gauge, reliable and simple. She loaded both with shaking hands. Dawson watched with approval. You know how to use those? Yes. Good. Because I think we're about to need them. The sound came a moment later. The hatch being opened, voices, urgent and angry. Claire and Dawson moved a window, keeping back from direct view. 3 men emerged from underground, moving quickly, carrying heavy duffel bags. The inventory they decided to take. But they weren't heading for their vehicles. They were heading for the cabin. They know I'm here, Claire said quietly. Probably saw my boot prints in the dust, or Gunner's tracks. They know I didn't really leave. Then we hold them off until backup arrives. Dawson positioned herself by the front door, weapon ready. You take the back. Anyone tries to come through, you warn them once. Then you shoot to stop them. Not to kill, to stop. Understand the difference. Claire moved to the back door, the Remington heavy in her hands. Through the window, she could see the men spreading out, surrounding the cabin. Professional tactics. They'd done this before. A voice called out, the big man's voice from underground. Claire Madsen, we know you called someone. We saw the ranger's truck. That was stupid. Dawson caught Claire's eye, put a finger to her lips. Don't respond. Here's how this is going to work. The voice continued. You and the ranger are going to come out, hands up, no weapons. We're going to have a conversation about what happens next. If you cooperate, nobody gets hurt. If you don't... A pause. Well, accidents happen in the mountains. People disappear all the time. Still Dawson signaled silence. You've got 30 seconds to come out. Then we come in, and we won't be gentle. Claire's heart hammered. 3 armed professionals against 1 ranger and 1 grieving widow. The math wasn't good, but maybe it didn't have to be. There's a root cellar, Claire whispered to Dawson. Real one, separate from the cache. Access through a door in the kitchen floor. We could hide there, wait them out. Dawson shook her head. They'd find us. Better control the space we're in than get trapped somewhere worse. 20 seconds. Gunner growled low, his attention fixed on the back door. Someone was approaching from that direction. Trying to flank them, Claire raised a rifle. Sighting through the window, saw a man, the shorter one from underground. Moving carefully around the corner of the cabin, weapon up and ready. She fired a warning shot above his head. The crack of the rifle incredibly loud in the enclosed space. The man dove for cover behind a woodpile. Federal Ranger. Dawson shouted from the front. You are on government property interfering with a federal investigation. Drop your weapons and surrender now. The response was immediate, gunfire. Bullets punched through the front door and windows, forcing Dawson to drop flat. Claire ducked instinctively, but kept her position covering the back. So much for talking, Dawson muttered. She returned fire through the shattered window. Controlled bursts, not panicking. Claire, you still have eyes on the back? Yes. 1 man behind the woodpile. The other 2 are at the front with you. We're going to need a better position. This cabin isn't fortified. They'll shoot through the walls if they want. As if in response, bullets tore through the back wall, splintering with inches from Claire's head. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the rifle. The man behind the woodpile was advancing, using covering fire from his companions. In seconds, he'd be at the back door, and then they'd be fighting at close quarters where the men's training and experience would overwhelm any advantage Claire and Dawson had. Claire made a decision. She dropped the rifle and grabbed the shotgun, moved aside of the door where she'd have the angle when it opened. Gunner positioned himself beside her, body coiled and ready. The door exploded inward, kicked open with military efficiency. The man came through fast, weapon sweeping the room. Gunner launched himself at the man's gun arm. 80 pounds of German shepherd hit, like a missile, jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. He screamed, his weapon discharging wildly as he fell. Claire stepped around and put the shotgun barrel against his head. Don't move. The man froze, Gunner's teeth still locked on his wrist, blood streaming down his arm. His weapon had fallen to the floor. Claire kicked it away, keeping the shotgun steady despite her shaking hands. Call off your partners, she said. Tell them to stand down. You think they care about me? They'll shoot through you to get to me if they have to. He was probably right. But now Claire had a hostage, which changed the tactical situation. From the front room, Dawson called out, Claire, status? I've got 1. He's down. Can you move him? Claire prodded the man with the shotgun. Get up, slowly. He stood, Gunner releasing his wrist but staying close, teeth bared. Claire forced the man toward the front room, using him as a shield. When they emerged, she saw that Dawson had taken up position behind the overturned kitchen table, using it as cover. The front wall was riddled with bullet holes, letting in shafts of afternoon light. Smart, Dawson said, seeing the hostage. That buys us time. The big man's voice came from outside. Marcus? You good in there? The man Claire held, Marcus, stayed silent. Claire pressed the shotgun barrel harder against his spine. Answer him, she whispered. I'm captured, Marcus called out. She's got me. A long pause. Then, well, shit, this changes things. Dawson moved to the broken window, careful to stay in cover. This is Ranger Patricia Dawson. I have backup incoming, multiple agencies, 20 minutes out. You cannot win this. Surrender now and face weapons charges, or stay and face murder charges when you kill a federal officer. Your choice. Another pause. Claire could almost hear the calculation happening outside. Then, unexpectedly, a different voice. Older, familiar. Torres, hold your fire. I'm coming in. Don't shoot. He appeared in the doorway, hands raised, no weapon visible. He looked older than he had underground, diminished somehow. His eyes found Claire's, and she saw resignation there. Acceptance. They're leaving, he said quietly, taking what they can carry and leaving. They don't want federal murder charges any more than you want to die here. Just leaving. Dawson sounded skeptical. Leaving their man behind? Marcus knew the risks when he signed up. He's a mercenary, not a brother. They don't owe him anything. Torres moved further into the cabin, slow and careful. But they wanted me to tell you something. If you report what you found, if you bring authorities to that cache, they will come back. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. They have lawyers, connections, resources. They'll tie you up in court for years, bankrupt you with legal fees, make your life hell. Let them try, Claire said, her voice steadier than she felt. Or, Torres continued, you could let them take what they want tonight. Clear out the inventory, leave nothing but empty rooms and old bones. Then when authorities come, there's no crime to prosecute, just tragic history. Everyone walks away clean. Except the dead, Claire said. Except my grandmother and James Creston and Robert Crane. Except everyone who's died because my grandfather built his life on violence and secrets. Torres nodded slowly. Except the dead. You're right. I'm sorry. He reached into his jacket pocket. Dawson's weapon came up instantly, but Torres moved slowly, deliberately non-threatening. He pulled out a folded paper and set it on the floor. That's a map, he said. Shows where Edward buried Miriam. I found it in his papers after he died. Kept it all these years, thinking someday I might do the right thing. He laughed bitterly. Took 70 years and another woman's courage to make me act. Claire stared at the paper, her throat tight. Why now? Because I'm 74 years old, and I'm tired carrying other people's sins. Because you deserve to know where your grandmother is. Because maybe if one truth gets told, it'll matter more than all the lies I protected. He backed toward the door. The big man, his name is Kellerman, former military contractor, now runs weapons to anyone who'll pay. He'll keep his word about leaving if you let him go clean tonight. But if you pursue this, if you try to bring him down, he will destroy you. I'll take my chances, Claire said. Torres nodded, unsurprised. I figured. You're braver than I ever was. He paused at the door. Your grandfather was a hard man, did terrible things. But he loved you in his way. When you visited as a child, those were the only times I ever saw him at peace. Then he was gone, disappearing into the forest as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Marcus, still held at shotgun point, laughed without humor. He's right, you know. Kellerman will destroy you. This isn't over. Yes, it is, Dawson said quietly. She was at the window, watching something. Backup just arrived. Claire moved to look. Down the forest road, through the trees, she could see vehicles approaching. Sheriff's Department, State Police, the cavalry finally arriving. Marcus sagged, the fight going out of him. Guess I'm the one who's destroyed instead. They held him until the first sheriff's deputies arrived, weapons drawn, securing the scene with professional efficiency. Claire told her story 3 times to the sheriff, to the state police detective, to the FBI agent who arrived an hour later. She showed them the hatch, led them underground, watched their expressions shift from skepticism to shock as they saw the cache, the skeleton of Robert Crane, James Creston's room. The FBI agent, a woman in her 40s named Sarah Chun, examined Crane's remains with something like reverence. We've been looking for him for 67 years. His family never stopped hoping he'd be found. Will you find the others? Claire asked. Kellerman and his men? We'll try. But Torres was right. These people have resources and connections. It won't be easy. Chun looked at Claire directly. You understand you'll be protected. Witness protection, if necessary. We don't abandon people who help us expose this kind of operation. I'm not leaving this mountain, Claire said. This is my home. Even knowing they might come back? Especially knowing that. I spent 11 months running from pain, hiding from life. I'm done running. Chin nodded slowly. Brave. Possibly foolish, but brave. As evening fell and the forensics team began their careful work, Claire climbed the ridge where she'd gotten cell service earlier. This time, she had a different call to make. Her father's cousin, Uncle Marcus, though he was technically a second cousin, answered on the third ring. "Claire, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "I'm sorry. I've been disconnected." She took a breath. "Marcus, I need to tell you something about your Uncle Edward, about what really happened to Miriam." She told him everything. The cash, the violence, James Creston's vigil, the accidental death. When she finished, there was long silence on the line. "I always knew there was something wrong," Marcus said finally. "My father, Thomas, your grandfather, he never talked about his mother, said it hurt too much. But I think he knew something wasn't right about how she died. Torres gave me a map. Shows where Edward buried her. The FBI is going to recover her remains, give her a proper burial, after 70 years. Marcus's voice was thick with emotion. "Jesus, Claire, our whole family has been living with this poison, not even knowing it was there. Not anymore. The truth is out now. What are you going to do? Stay up there?" "Yes. With armed criminals knowing where you are, the FBI will patrol regularly. The cache will be cleared out, sealed permanently. And I have Gunner." As if summoned, the dog appeared at her side, pressing against her leg. She scratched his ears, grateful for his solid presence. "You sound different," Marcus said. "Stronger somehow." "I spent almost a year being numb. Being dead inside felt safer than feeling anything. But I'd rather feel everything. The fear, the anger, the grief, than feel nothing at all. Paul will be proud of you." Claire felt tears on her face, the first she'd shed since Paul died. "I hope so. I hope he'd understand that I had to stop hiding, that surviving isn't the same as living." They talked for a few more minutes, making plans for Marcus to visit, to help with the aftermath of everything that had been uncovered. When Claire finally ended the call, full darkness had fallen over the mountain. She stood on the ridge looking at the lights down at the cabin. Forensics teams, law enforcement, the careful documentation of 70 years of secrets. Her home had become a crime scene, her family legacy transformed into evidence. But somehow, standing here in the darkness with stars brilliant overhead and the cold wind carrying the scent of pine, Claire felt more at peace than she had in 11 months. Truth hurt. It was messy and complicated, and exposed things that had been carefully hidden. But it was also clean in a way lies could never be. It was honest. It was real. And real, Claire had finally learned, was the only way to actually survive. Section 8, the victory. The FBI team worked for 3 days, carefully excavating and documenting everything in the underground complex. Claire stayed at a hotel in town during the worst of it, unable to sleep in the cabin while strangers moved through her home. But she returned each day to answer questions and watch the careful work of justice. They found more than anyone expected. The cache inventory included over 60 rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, enough explosives to level a building, and military equipment that hadn't been used since the Korean War. Agent Chin estimated the street value at over $3 million, a staggering fortune that Edward Madsen had been sitting on and selling from for 7 decades. More disturbing were the documents they found in a sealed box behind the workbench. Edward had kept meticulous records of every sale, every buyer, every transaction. Names, dates, amounts. A complete ledger of an illegal operation spanning 50 years. Your grandfather was careful, Chin told Claire as they reviewed the documents. Almost paranoid about documentation. He wanted proof of who he'd dealt with, probably as leverage if anyone ever turned on him. Can you prosecute anyone from this? Some. Many of the buyers are dead or too old to face trial effectively. But there are names here connected to domestic terrorism incidents, militia movements, even one foreign arms dealer we've been tracking for decades. This ledger is going to open a lot of cold cases. They also found James Creston's remains, exactly where Claire had first seen them, along with his journal and photographs. Agent Chun handled these with particular care. This man lived under your grandfather's cabin for 7 years, waiting to rescue my grandmother. He loved her. And your grandfather knew he was down there? Eventually, I think they reached some kind of understanding. James knew about the weapons cache, could have reported it. Edward knew about James, could have turned him in as a stalker. So they existed in this mutually assured destruction stalemate. Chin shook her head. The things people do for love. For money, the secrets they keep. On the third day, using Torres's map, they found Miriam's grave. It was 2 miles from the cabin, in a small clearing near a creek. The grave was deep and carefully prepared. Edward had done it right, despite everything. Had given his wife at least that much dignity. Claire stood with Marcus and a dozen law enforcement personnel as a forensics team carefully excavated. When they finally uncovered the remains, wrapped in what had once been a quilt, Claire felt something break open inside her chest. She was trying to escape, she said quietly to Marcus. She deserved to be free, and instead she ended up here. She is free now, Marcus said. Finally, they held a proper funeral a week later. Claire, Marcus, and 24 relatives Claire barely knew, all gathered to finally put Miriam Madsen to rest with full knowledge of how she died. The service was simple, but honest. The pastor spoke about truth and freedom, and the importance of facing hard histories. Claire read from James Creston's journal. The parts about his love for Miriam, his admiration for her strength, his sorrow that he couldn't save her. It seemed right that his voice should be heard at her burial, that his 7-year vigil should be acknowledged. They buried Miriam in the town cemetery, next to a plot reserved for Claire's father. Family together finally, the secrets no longer dividing them. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories like this one. The legal aftermath took months to unfold. Marcus was arrested trying to cross into Canada and extradited back to Montana to face weapons trafficking charges. He was cooperating with federal prosecutors, giving up names and locations in exchange for a reduced sentence. Torres turned himself in 2 weeks after the initial discovery. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy, illegal weapon sales, and accessory to concealing a federal crime. At 74, facing 15 years in federal prison, he seemed almost relieved that his decades of silence were finally over. I should have come forward years ago, he told Claire during a supervised visit at the county jail. Should have told someone what Edward had done, what we were all doing. But I was scared and greedy and convinced myself that silence was the same as innocence. It wasn't, Claire said. No, it wasn't. Torres looked older, diminished in his orange jumpsuit. For what it's worth, your grandmother was a good woman. I only met her once, right before she died, but I could tell she deserved better than Edward gave her. Did you know about James while he was alive? No, I truly didn't. If I had... Torres trailed off. I'd like to think I would have done something. But honestly, I probably would have kept quiet about that too. I was very good at keeping quiet. Claire left the jail feeling hollow. Justice was being done. Criminals were being prosecuted. Victims were being acknowledged. Truth was being exposed. But it was a cold kind of justice, empty of satisfaction. The dead were still dead. The years of secrets still left their scars. The weapons cache was cleared completely, every item cataloged and removed. The FBI sealed both underground chambers with concrete, filling them completely so they could never be used again. The hatch was removed, the opening covered with earth and stones. Claire stood watching as they did the final work, transforming the site back to ordinary ground. Within a year, grass and moss would grow over the filled space, and you'd never know anything had been there. Nature reclaiming what humans had poisoned. Agent Chin approached as the last truck pulled away. That's it. The site is officially cleared and sealed. You can return to normal life. Normal, Claire repeated. I'm not sure I know what that is anymore. Fair. Chin pulled out a business card. This is my personal number. If you ever feel unsafe, if anyone connected to this operation approaches you, you call immediately. The Bureau takes protection of witnesses seriously. I appreciate that. I mean it. Kellerman is still at large. We've got warrants out international notifications, but he's gone to ground. He's probably smart enough to cut his losses and disappear, but Chin hesitated. Men like him don't like being exposed, don't like losing profitable operations. Just be careful. After Chin left, Claire walked the clearing with Gunnar, seeing her home with new eyes. The cabin looked the same as it had 11 months ago when she'd first arrived, grieving and broken and desperate for solitude. But everything was different now. She'd come here to hide from life, and instead she'd uncovered death. She'd wanted silence, and instead she'd exposed secrets that had been buried for 7 decades. She'd thought isolation would protect her from pain, and instead she'd learned that the only way to survive pain was to face it directly. Paul would have found the irony amusing. He'd always said she couldn't run from grief, that it would find her wherever she went. He'd been right, but not in the way either of them expected. Miss Madsen? Claire turned to find a young woman standing at the edge of the clearing, early 30s, professional clothes, carrying a leather briefcase. She looked nervous but determined. "I'm Rebecca Crane," the woman said. "Robert Crane was my grandfather, the FBI agent who died here." Claire's throat tightened. "I'm so sorry for what my grandfather did, for the years your family spent not knowing. Don't apologize for him. His crimes aren't yours." Rebecca stepped closer. "I wanted to thank you. My grandmother died 5 years ago, never knowing what happened to her husband. But my father, Robert's son, he's finally got closure. Finally got to bury his father properly. That's because of you. I just found what was hidden." "I didn't." "You could have kept it hidden," Rebecca interrupted. "Could have covered the hatch back up, pretended you never found anything. No one would have known. But you didn't. You exposed it. Even knowing it would complicate your life, would bring danger. That took courage. Or stupidity." Rebecca smiled slightly. "Maybe both. But I'm grateful anyway." She pulled an envelope from her briefcase. "My father wanted you to have this. It's a letter my grandfather wrote to my grandmother before he came to Montana in 1958. The last letter she ever received from him." Claire took the envelope with shaking hands. "Why give this to me?" "Because it talks about why he became an agent, about wanting to protect people, to stand up for what was right even when it was dangerous. My father thought you'd understand that impulse." Rebecca turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. My grandfather noted in his field reports that he suspected Edward Madsen wasn't working alone, that there was a larger network, possibly with connections to organized crime and anti-government groups. The FBI is still investigating those connections. Your grandfather's ledger has opened a lot of doors." After Rebecca left, Claire sat on her porch and opened the letter. Robert Crane's handwriting was neat and careful, the word of a man who chose him thoughtfully. "My dearest Helen, I'm heading to Montana tomorrow to follow up on leads about illegal weapons trafficking. It could be dangerous. These are people who've been running their operations successfully for a decade, and they won't want exposure. But this is why I became an agent, not for the glory or the adventure, but because some people prey on the vulnerable and powerless, and someone needs to stand against them. If something happens to me, know that I died doing work that mattered. Know that I love you and our son more than anything. And know that I have to believe, that truth and justice are worth fighting for, even when the fight is hard. Forever yours, Robert." Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Robert Crane had died fighting for truth. James Creston had died for love. Her grandmother had died trying to be free. And Edward Madsen had spent his life building an empire of violence and secrets, believing somehow that he was justified. What legacy was Claire building? What would she be remembered for? She thought about the past year. 11 months of hiding, of numbness, of choosing safety over engagement. And then 3 days had changed everything, uncovering secrets, facing danger, deciding that truth mattered more than comfort. Paul had once told her that teaching history wasn't about memorizing dates and names. It was about understanding that people in the past were just as complex and flawed and human as people in the present, that the choices they made, for good or ill, shaped everything that came after. "We're all just trying to live with the consequences of other people's choices," he'd said. The question is whether we'll have the courage to make better choices ourselves. Claire had spent a year living with the consequences of Paul's death, of cancer's cruelty, of grief's weight. But she'd also been living, without realizing it, with the consequences of her grandfather's choices, of James Creston's obsessive love, of her grandmother's desperate attempt to escape. Now she had a choice of her own to make. What came next? How did she live on this land, in this cabin, knowing everything she knew? She could sell the property, walk away, start over somewhere else. The FBI had offered assistance with relocation if she wanted it. She could leave this mountain and never look back. Or she could stay, could reclaim this space from its poison history, could transform it into something new, could choose to remember the victims, Miriam, James, Robert, rather than the perpetrator, could make this a place of truth rather than secrets. The choice felt enormous, life-defining. But as Claire sat with it, watching the afternoon light slant through the pines, she realized the decision had already been made. She'd made it the moment she decided to open the hatch rather than cover it back up, the moment she'd chosen truth over comfort, exposure over silence. She was staying. This was her home, and she was going to make it worthy of the people who died here. Section 9, The New Life. 6 months later, Claire stood in her rebuilt cabin and barely recognized the space. The FBI had released the property after their investigation concluded, and she'd spent the intervening months transforming it. New floors, new walls, new windows that let in floods of mountain light. The stone fireplace remained. Some things were worth preserving, but everything else had been stripped down and rebuilt. The underground chambers were sealed permanently, but Claire had placed a memorial above where the hatch had been. A simple stone marker with 3 names engraved. Miriam Madsen, James Creston, Robert Crane. They deserved freedom. They deserved truth. May they finally rest in peace. The cabin was a home now, not a hiding place. Claire had returned to teaching, but differently. She developed an online curriculum about hidden histories, about the secrets families keep and how those secrets poison generations. Her students were adults, people dealing with their own family mysteries and inherited traumas. The work felt meaningful in a way her old high school teaching never had. She'd also started writing a book. The story of what she'd found, what her grandfather had done, the network of illegal weapons trafficking that had operated in the American West for decades. Agent Chun had helped her get access to declassified FBI files, and several journalists had contributed research. It would be published next year by a university press, part of a series on hidden American histories. But the most significant change was the people. Claire had spent 11 months avoiding human connection, convinced that isolation was safer than vulnerability. Now her cabin was rarely empty. Marcus visited every month, bringing his teenage daughter to learn about their family history. The truth of it, not the sanitized version. Rebecca Crane came quarterly, working on her own project about her grandfather's life and final case. Even Agent Chin stopped by when she was in the area, checking on Claire, but also, Claire suspected, drawn to the strange peace of this mountain place. And there were new friends. Patricia Dawson, the ranger who'd stood with her during those terrifying hours waiting for backup, had become a close companion. They hiked together, shared meals, talked about everything from forestry management to the weight of family secrets. "You could have died that day," Patricia said one evening as they sat on Claire's porch watching the sunset. "Armed criminals, no backup for hours. You had every reason to run. I'd been running for 11 months. I was tired of it. Still, not many people would have stood their ground." Claire scratched Gunner's ears. The dog had become something of a celebrity, the German shepherd who uncovered a 70-year-old crime. Multiple news outlets had wanted to interview him, which Claire found absurd but also oddly touching. "I think grief had made me reckless," she said honestly. "When Paul died, I felt like I'd already lost everything that mattered. So what did I have to lose by telling the truth? And now I have things to lose again. This place, these connections, the work I'm doing." Claire smiled. Turns out being vulnerable, having things you care about, it's not weakness. It's what makes life worth living. Patricia raised her coffee mug in a toast to vulnerability, and to German shepherds who dig where they're not supposed to. They clinked mugs, and Gunnar woofed his agreement. The legal cases were slowly resolving. Torres had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, though at his age it was effectively a life sentence. He'd taken full responsibility for his actions, refused to minimize or justify. In a strange way, Claire respected that. Better late than never to face the truth. Marcus the mercenary had received 20 years after his cooperation. He'd given up dozens of names, locations of other weapons caches, connections to militia groups and foreign buyers. The FBI estimated his testimony would lead to at least 50 additional prosecutions. Kellerman remained at large. The FBI had tracked him to Mexico, then lost him. He was presumed to have left North America entirely, probably using one of several false identities the investigation had uncovered. Agent Chin assured Claire he was unlikely to return. The risk was too high, and there were easier places to operate his illegal business. But Claire kept the rifles loaded and accessible anyway, just in case. The book about Miriam's life was the hardest thing Claire had ever written. Not the facts of her death, but the life that preceded it. The young woman who'd chosen practicality over love, who'd married Edward Madsen believing he offered security, who'd slowly realized a mistake but felt trapped by circumstance and isolation. Claire interviewed everyone she could find who'd known Miriam, distant relatives, old neighbors, women who'd worked with her at the church in Butte before she married. A portrait emerged of someone strong and practical, but also romantic. Someone who'd loved James Creston deeply, but hadn't believed that love was enough to build a life on. She wanted security. One of her old friends told Claire. Edward had a steady job, owned property, seemed solid. James was exciting but uncertain military life, moving around, no roots. She chose Edward because she thought that was a mature, responsible choice. Did she regret it? I think so. The last time I saw her, a few months before she died, she seemed diminished somehow, like she'd folded herself up to fit into a smaller space than she was meant to occupy. I asked if she was happy, and she said, "I'm managing." That's not the same thing, is it? It wasn't. And that realization, that her grandmother had spent years just managing, just surviving, had hit Claire hard, because she'd been doing the same thing. Managing her grief rather than processing it. Surviving rather than living. Paul wouldn't have wanted that for her. He'd have wanted her to rage and cry and feel everything, and then to slowly, painfully find her way back to joy. She was finding it now. Not the same joy she'd had when Paul was alive. That was gone forever, and pretending otherwise was dishonest. But a different joy, harder one and more deliberate. The joy of good work done well. Of connections carefully maintained. Of a dog's warmth and mountain sunsets and coffee shared with friends. 1 year after discovering the hatch, Claire organized a gathering at the cabin. Everyone who'd been part of uncovering the truth came. Agent Chun, Patricia Dawson, Marcus's daughter, Rebecca Crane and her father. Even Torres's daughter, who'd had nothing to do with her father's crimes but wanted to meet the people who'd exposed them. They stood around the memorial stone while Claire spoke. "We're here because of the German shepherd who wouldn't stop digging," she began, getting a small laugh. "But we're also here because the secrets have weight, because truth matters, because the dead deserve to be remembered honestly, not sanitized or forgotten." She talked about Miriam, not just how she died, but how she lived, about her strength, her choices, her attempt to escape. She talked about James Creston, whose love had been obsessive and ultimately tragic, but who genuinely tried to save someone he cared about. She talked about Robert Crane, who died doing his job, protecting people from predators who thought themselves above the law. "This mountain holds a lot of pain," Claire continued. 70 years of secrets, violence, exploitation. My grandfather built his life on cruelty and lies, and everyone who got close paid the price. But we're here now, telling the truth, remembering the victims, refusing to let silence bury what needs to be known. That matters. That changes things. Agent Chin spoke next, talking about the FBI's continuing investigation and the dozens of cold cases being reopened because of Claire's discovery. Rebecca Crane read from her grandfather's letters. Patricia Dawson talked about the importance of public lands and the people who protect them. And Torres's daughter, Sandra, soft-spoken and clearly uncomfortable, Talked about growing up not knowing what her father did, about the shame of discovering his crimes, about trying to build a life separate from his choices. I can't change what he did, Sandra said. I can't make amends for his crimes. But I can refuse to keep quiet, refuse to minimize, refuse to protect him from consequences. Sometimes that's all we can do. Refuse to continue the pattern. After the gathering ended and people began leaving, Marcus pulled Claire aside. Your father will be proud of you, he said. Thomas spent his whole life haunted by his mother's death, never knowing the truth. You uncover that truth. That matters more than you probably realize. I wish he'd lived to know it. Maybe he doesn't know. If there's anything after death, any awareness, he knows. Marcus squeezed her shoulder. And Paul knows too. Knows you didn't let grief destroy you. Knows you found your way back to living. After everyone left, Claire sat on her porch with Gunnar and watched the stars emerge. The mountain was quiet, peaceful, the troubled ground beneath her cabin finally at rest. The secrets were out, the bodies recovered and properly buried, the criminals facing justice or fled into hiding. She'd done what needed doing. And somehow, in the process of exposing her grandfather's crimes and honoring the victims, she'd found her way back to herself. Not the self she'd been before Paul died. That woman was gone, transformed by grief and loss. But a new self, harder and softer simultaneously. Someone who understood that truth could hurt, but lies poisoned. That isolation felt safe, but connection was necessary. That surviving was important, but living was the goal. We did it, boy, she told Gunnar. We uncovered the truth. We faced the danger. We survived. Gunnar's tail thumped against the porch boards. And tomorrow we get up and do it again. Live another day. Make another choice. Build something better on this poisoned ground. The dog rested his head on her knee, and Claire felt something she hadn't felt in almost 2 years. Not happiness exactly, but contentment, the sense that she was where she belonged, doing what she was meant to do, honoring both the dead and the living by refusing to hide from hard truths. Her grandfather had believed that secrets kept people safe, that burying the truth protected the guilty and spared the innocent. He'd been wrong about that, as he'd been wrong about so many things. Secrets didn't protect. They metastasized. They poisoned everything they touched, spreading through generations like inherited disease. But truth, even painful truth, could heal, could free people from the weight of not knowing, could honor the dead by acknowledging how they'd really lived and died. Claire had learned that lesson the hard way, had paid for it with fear and danger and the complete appending of the quiet grief she'd tried to maintain. But she'd learned it, and she'd keep teaching it, through her book and her classes and her life lived openly on this mountain. Some places hold memories so painful you spend a lifetime running from them. But sometimes, if you're brave enough to stop running and face what's buried, you find not just pain but truth, not just loss but legacy, not just death but the possibility of new life built on honest ground. Claire Madsen had found all of that beneath her grandfather's cabin, and in finding it, she'd found herself again, not the woman she'd been, but the woman she was becoming. Stronger, braver, more honest, more alive. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.